Welcome to Truth Be Told. I'm Greg Borgon, President and Founder of Heart of a Warrior Ministries. A healthy rhythm of nurture and service is necessary for becoming spiritually mature. Emphasizing one over the other stunts one's spiritual growth. I know many people who come to church and are there every time the door is open, listen to every sermon, are a part of every small group, every study group, listen to sermons online. They're constantly filling up their sponge. Constantly filling it up. Now, the interesting thing about a sponge is if you continue to fill it up with water, like I'm doing right now, it won't be long before you saturate the sponge, and the water won't be retained by the sponge, as you can witness right now, as the water is kind of filling up around the sides, because the sponge, in essence, is completely full. Completely saturated. There's no more water that can get in there. And so when we spend a lot of our time, or most of our time, in nurturing activities, filling up our sponge, it isn't long before we're saturated. And a pastor or a friend might hear from the individual who has been saturated, you know what, I'm leaving this place. I'm not being fed anymore. So when Christians focus their time and efforts primarily on filling up their sponge through activities that I've mentioned, designed to provide input only, it won't be long before you hear them make that kind of a response. I'm leaving this place, I'm just not being fed anymore. Now, other folks who come to church or are followers of Christ spend all their time in service with no nurture. They're continually wringing out their lives into other people's lives. Every time a project is mentioned and volunteers are solicited, well, they're the first to jump on the bandwagon. These kinds of folks often find it hard to sit still even in a church to listen to a message because they'd rather be serving in some capacity than sitting there to be nurtured in many cases. Now, if I were to wring out this sponge without filling it, the sponge would become dry. And ultimately, if I kept doing this, no matter how much effort I exerted, it would crumble in my hands over time. It would take increasing effort to wring out anything from it. So when Christians focus their time and efforts primarily wringing out their sponge, though through repeated acts of service, void of any nurture, it won't be long before you hear them say, I'm leaving this place. No one appreciates what I do around here anymore. What happens when our spiritual sponge is saturated? We become spiritually smug. Whatever we receive from that point on will not sink in. We're saturated. What happens when there's nothing left to wring out? We plateau. We are serving on fumes. It takes more effort to accomplish what we have in the past with little effort. Our attitude shifts to a victim mentality. We constantly give of our time and talents. We continually serve without recharging our batteries. We're constantly wringing out without filling up. So as this illustration so aptly points out, a sponge can only absorb a certain volume of water. More water will simply run over the sides once the sponge is saturated. The sponge must be wrung out before more water can be absorbed. A rhythm between nurture and service is necessary for healthy spiritual development. So a life focused on receiving nurture alone will eventually result in a spiritual arrogance and a statement like we just described. I'm not being fed anymore. A life focused on service alone will eventually result in fatigue and burnout, and we'll hear from them as we pointed out, no one really appreciates what I do here anymore. So our spiritual rhythm is to fill up our spiritual sponge through nurturing activities such as worship and prayer, study, reflection, meditation, memorizing God's Word, fellowship, and personal application to our lives. And to wring out what we have learned into people's lives, we do through service and outreach, and projects and ways to go ahead and meet other people's needs. So our spiritual rhythm is to fill up and wring out. Fill up and wring out. Fill up and wring out. So I'd like to leave you with this challenge. On a sheet of paper, put 2 columns and label the left column nurture and the right column service. And in the nurture column, identify all those activities that you are involved in that fill up your sponge. On the other side of the ledger, under service, fill in all those activities where you're wringing out into other people's lives, where you're serving others. Now, the list will vary simply because of the scope of whatever the activity might be, whether it be nurture or it be service. But it'll give you a real good idea of how you're involving yourself in activities of either nurture or service. The idea is to develop a rhythm of filling up so that you have something to wring out in other people's lives, and making sure that the sponge doesn't get too dry. On the other side of the issue is making sure that the sponge doesn't get saturated and you're not wringing out what God's pouring into you. So the idea again is to develop a spiritual rhythm which will lead to spiritual maturity. Well, I hope this little object lesson was helpful to you, and until we meet again, may God bless you.